Hello, 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 and welcome to another exciting episode of our weekly Cloud On Air Innovator Series. I'm Chloe Condon, a cloud advocate here at Google, and I'll be your hostess each week as we dive into different technical topics, watch demos together, and learn best practices from some of our top experts here at Google. If you joined us last week or the week before or the week before, welcome back. We're so excited to see you again. And if you're new here, welcome. We're so excited to have you join us and be a part of our community. Let us know in the chat how many times you've joined us. Now, if you're joining us live, you may notice that we have a live chat. Feel free to use this space to interact with other viewers and ask any questions you may have about the topics being discussed in today's session. One of our moderators will try to answer you live in chat, or you may just be lucky enough to have your question answered live on air during our Q&A session with our speaker at the end of this presentation. And if you're not joining us live, make sure to register for one of our upcoming sessions so you can join in on the fun live as it happens. We have fun in the chat. To learn more, check out cloudonair.withgoogle.com and you'll be able to take a look at our previous streams and register for some of our upcoming live sessions. You can take a look at previous sessions or take a little peek at some of our upcoming ones where we'll be covering cloud topics like data analytics, Gen AI, security, developer productivity, and so much more. We have a great library of content for you to look through, so feel free to check out our catalog of videos from Google experts that you can watch on demand for free, prepare some of your favorite snacks, have a whole time out of it. Well, without further ado, let's begin today's session. Take it away.
Wow, thank you so much, Chloe. That was an amazing introduction. Everyone, I'd like to welcome you to Take the Guesswork Out of Cloud Management with AI-driven recommendations, an introduction to Active Assist. I'm Lucas Carlson. I'm a Cloud Innovator Champion, and I'm here with Sharon Fang of Google, and we're excited to teach you all about Active Assist. Hi, Sharon. Today we're going to be going through an introduction to this product area and what it entails. I'm going to run through all the different services that have recommendations and tell you how you can make best use of them. And I'm going to do a deep dive on the IAM recommender in particular to teach you all about how that works and what goes on behind the scenes. Sharon's going to talk about some of the things that are new, and then we're going to go through some of the tips and tricks and take some of your questions. Now, for an introduction to Active Assist, here is Sharon.
Thank you so much, Lucas. So diving straight in, kind of giving you some context on, why Active Assist exists as a product today. The cloud is complicated. There's a lot of problems that we know that our users deal with when trying to manage their cloud. They have waste problems. For example, their discounts aren't optimized. They're paying for unnecessary resources. There's security gaps that are hard to manage with a lot of overgranting of permissions or confusing settings. And then just like a lot of additional work to managing your cloud. So trying to fix misconfigurations or trouble identifying root cause of problems. We know that the cloud is complicated, and that's kind of why Active Assist exists today. So moving on to the next slide, this is where Active Assist comes along. So it's essentially a solution portfolio that uses data, intelligence, and machine learning to help customers better manage their cloud. We try to make it easier for you to build and optimize everything that you have on the cloud. The solution portfolio contains a variety of things, including what we have below, like recommendations, embedded intelligence, and intelligence centers. In today's session, we'll mostly focus on recommendations. Next slide. So these are kind of how we imagine or categorize all of the recommendations that we have into these 6 value pillars. So everything from helping you manage your costs, improving your security, your performance, your reliability, manageability, or even sustainability. We hope that, if you care about one or more of these things, that we'll have recommendations that help you optimize your cloud in these areas. Yeah, this is just like an overall portfolio of everything that we have to offer. And Lucas will go into more details about some of these that we have here to explain exactly what kind of recommendations that we have to offer. And then finally, I just wanted to give some kind of terminology explanation that we'll continuously use throughout this presentation today. So an insight is an observed event. So for example, of an insight is this VM has had low CPU utilization during the past 10 events. So Active Assist will point out any insights that we have for you in any of those product areas or any of those value categories. But then from there, we might give you a recommendation. And this is really a call to action because of one or more of those insights. So because we've observed that a VM has had low CPU utilization, our recommendation would be to resize the VM to a smaller machine type. It's really Google's kind of opinion of what you should do based off of that insight. So again, just distinguishing some terminology that we'll frequently use in this presentation. So that's kind of just an overview. I think now I'll hand it back to Lucas, who can talk a little bit more in depth about each recommendation.
Yeah, well, I'm going to focus mainly on recommendations here, but what I want people to remember is that all of these recommendations are driven by the insights, and you also have access to the insights. So even if you don't want to leverage the recommendations features that come from Google, you can use the same insights that Google is using to build your own tools and make your own recommendation system. And so let's dig into the different services that have recommendations and what they do for you and how you can use them. I'm going to kind of go through this by the services that I use the most. And so I might not touch on all of the services and all of the features, but I want you guys to have a good sense of what you can do with this. So the first one is Cloud Functions. Currently, there is one type of recommendation available for Cloud Functions, and it's the minimum instances recommendation. And what this will do is it will look at all of your Cloud Functions, and it will look over the last 90 days or so of activity to determine if any of those functions are suffering from or likely to suffer from frequent cold starts. It will then recommend to you that you should increase the minimum instances on those functions in order to reduce the number of cold starts, which is a wonderful feature. Cloud Run, I talk about all the time. This is one of my favorite services. There are a bunch of useful recommendations here. The first one I'm going to talk about is a cost-based recommendation. Basically, it looks at whether you're using the CPU allocation during requests feature and if your workloads would actually be less expensive by using the CPU always allocated setting. So this way you can go in and kind of set up your Cloud Run services initially, and then you can find out a couple months later, 3 months later, that some of them could benefit from having the CPU allocated differently. Also, and you'll see this across several of the services, there are suggestions around committed use discounts. So there are opportunities based on how much you're using a particular service that you could potentially purchase a committed use discount in advance, and using the same service the same way you're using it now would cost less. And so rather than you have to analyze all of your behaviors and figure out what might be good, Google's going to produce a bunch of useful recommendations around which specific CUDs you might want to buy. In the security side, which is probably I'll mention that cost and security are the sets of recommendations that I find myself using the most, and they're usually the first ones I start looking at. And so a lot of what I'm going to focus on today are going to be cost and security recommendations. So with Cloud Run, each Cloud Run service that you have has a service account associated with it. And that service account has a set of roles at the project level and at the org level that grant it access to do different things. This will check and see if the service account that you're using on a particular service has more roles than is necessary, and it will suggest a better, more secure situation, potentially, for example, using a new service account with exactly the correct roles. This feature to scan your environment variables is also really useful. It will look through all your Cloud Run services, and it'll look for any environment variables that say API key or API underscore key, or any of them that end in the word password. And it will suggest to you that you should probably create a secret in the secret manager and store those values in there. Similarly, if you have an environment variable that includes your Google application credentials, those suggest that you should probably use service identity instead. And so this is great, especially if you have a lot of Cloud Run instances, or if there's a bunch of different people in your environment deploying things and they don't all follow the same best practices. This is a great way to get all your stuff in line. For Compute Engine, if you folks use Compute Engine, you've probably already interacted with these recommendations. You might log into the console and see one of your instances. Let's say it's over provisioned and you're spending too much money, and the console will provide you a little hint that you could save a certain number of dollars. And so I think a lot of folks have kind of seen these if they use Compute Engine. Just like with Cloud Run, you can get specific committed use discount recommendations. This will also call out if you have idle resources. So if you have virtual machines that are sitting around doing nothing, a bunch of disks, you already deleted the VMs, but the disks are still sitting around and they're not doing anything. Do you have like a bunch of IP addresses that are not attached to anything and you're paying for, or even some images? This is great, again, if you are not the only person touching the things in your environment. You got a lot of other people working. Not every person is as diligent about cleaning up after they're done, and so this can help you find all those opportunities to delete stuff you don't need anymore. Now, on both the cost and performance side, you get both cost and performance benefits from the machine type recommendations, because as I mentioned, if your machine is over provisioned and you're just paying for more than you need, then this will give you a recommendation to use a smaller instance, which will save you money. If, on the other hand, your machine is under provisioned and it's struggling for resources a lot of the time, then you will see a recommendation that suggests you use a larger instance size. And that will cost you more money, but it will also increase performance of your application. So these are probably, I think, one of the most likely recommendations you may have already experienced. In addition to the recommendations, which we're mostly focusing on here today, I also want people to note, if they're working with Compute Engine, that the firewall insights are also available. Now, unlike some of the things I just mentioned, Google hasn't built a specific recommender that analyzes those firewall insights and sends you recommendations. They're just providing you with the raw insights, just as they have with all the other things. So this at least gives you an opportunity, if you know what the expected behavior is, or what you want to see going on in your firewall, then you can mine those insights yourself, and you can look for problematic issues like firewall rules that are exposing things more widely than you intended. So if you're using Compute Engine, those are all the things that may be of interest. There are some things in GKE that are in addition to what you already have with the Compute Engine part of things. The one I find myself using the most is the unused clusters. Can't tell you how many times I've spun up a cluster to try something out and then forgot about it. And so having a recommender that calls out those unused clusters so you can go delete them is really valuable. Another one I use a lot is the deprecations. If you have GKE clusters running, then you will sometimes find that you're using one of those Kubernetes APIs that has been deprecated or is going to be deprecated. And this will let you know how many times you've used it and where you've been using it, so that you can deal with those issues before they impact your application. Moving on to BigQuery. So with BigQuery, there's a bunch of things to manage. In particular, folks have to decide like the best slotting setup whether they want to use reservations or go on demand. And that can sometimes be a challenging decision. So this recommender will actually look at the workloads you're running, and it will help you understand if you would actually benefit from moving to a different slot reservation setup. In addition, it will analyze your BigQuery tables to determine if there are certain columns that you should partition or cluster on in order to increase performance or to, and actually in this case, save money. The IAM recommender is something we're going to talk about a lot today. It's somewhat unique to some of these others because a lot of these recommenders are very product specific. Like the BigQuery slots recommender, that's very, very specific to BigQuery. But because IAM is used across all of Google Cloud, the IAM recommender provides recommendations for all different kinds of things. So in this case, one of the things the IAM recommender will provide recommendations for is your BigQuery data sets. And so that means if you have data sets that have been shared more widely than necessary, you can get recommendations that will tell you the best way to lock those down. Cloud SQL. Cloud SQL uses compute under the hood. So you have some of the same kinds of things like the committed use discount recommendations are available. So you can decide if you can save a bunch of money by buying some CUDs. In addition, you have the instance size recommendations. So you can tell if your instances are over provisioned and you might want to save some money by shrinking them, or if they're under provisioned and you might want to increase their size in order to increase performance. Similarly, it'll call out idle instances. So if you have that database you spun up for that application that you never ended up building, this thing will tell you and let you know that you can get rid of it. And for some of the SQL database types like MySQL and Postgres, there are some specific performance-based recommendations that help you avoid running out of open tables or transaction IDs. And in addition to that, there are a few reliability recommendations for Cloud SQL. There's one that would tell you if you could benefit from enabling higher availability. And there's one that will warn you if you're in danger of running out of disk. So I encourage you to check those out, especially if you're using Cloud SQL. For cloud storage, we also have an IAM permission recommender. So this will check all of your cloud storage buckets, and it will determine if the IAM permissions on them are too broad. I'll note that this is only looking at IAM permissions. So if you have buckets that are using traditional ACLs at the object level, this is not analyzing those. So I would encourage you to use bucket level permissions wherever you can. And I think Google is now recommending that for most folks. Okay, so now I wanted to go a little deeper into the IAM recommender in particular and to talk about kind of how that works and what's going on behind the scenes so you can get a gist of how these signals work and how Google's processing them. So specifically, the IAM recommender is going to provide recommendations that suggest replacing a role that somebody has with a more restrictive role. So, for example, if you granted someone owner on the project, but all they've been doing is viewing Firestore database information, then maybe it would suggest a role that just includes view permissions instead of all the permissions associated with an owner. The purpose of this recommender, as I'm sure many of you can guess, is that it helps you achieve the principle of least privilege. So ideally, when you're building cloud environments, you do not want to overgrant permissions. You do not want to use the default permissions if you don't have to. If you know specifically what someone is going to need to do, it would be best to grant them those permissions. And further, when you're building applications and services, you ideally want each of those services to only have the permissions necessary to do what it needs to do and not more than that. So this recommender is extremely helpful in that process. I rely on it very much because sometimes when you're building an application and you're getting started, you don't always know exactly what permissions you're going to need. And sometimes it can feel kind of tedious to figure all that out right from the beginning. So, sometimes you will find yourself granting more permissions than are necessary, especially as you're developing a new service. And so this really helps because it's going to keep an eye on what you're actually doing, and then it'll tell you what permissions you actually need rather than the ones you overgranted. So we talked a little bit about insights earlier. This particular recommender, the IAM recommender, which provides role recommendations, it is using information about policy insights, which specifically is referring to IAM policies, and about lateral movement insights, which I'm going to go into in a little more detail momentarily. So, again, as I mentioned earlier, you also have access to the policy insights. So you can go look at those policy insights, which will tell you things like which APIs people accessed in the last 90 days and what various kinds of things they were accessing. And then you could build your own analysis to determine what the right actions are for these different things. But this recommender is pulling the insights from those two sources in order to get us the information we need. Now, it's important to know about the observation period. By default, the observation period is 90 days. This is the max observation period, which means Google is not going to keep history longer than 90 days. So for folks who are concerned about data, your data and how long it's kept by Google, they have a strict policy that they're only keeping the logs for these various activities and all these insights for at most 90 days. And so that's the most amount of data that the recommenders have to leverage in order to make policy or recommendation decisions. So that's just important to note because if you have things that go on less frequently than 90 days, you could imagine a scenario where the recommender doesn't have enough information to give you a really good recommendation. And so it's useful to be thoughtful about that and to be aware of it. The other thing to note about the observation period, though, is the default minimum observation period is also 90 days, which means that when you start using a new service, you're not going to see any recommendations until 90 days of time have already passed. And so, if that is not okay with you, I believe at the project level, you can reduce the minimum observation period to either 30 or 60 days, which means you'll start getting recommendations sooner, but Google provides a warning that it may also mean that those recommendations may not be as accurate as they would be if they had more data. So something to think about when you're interacting with these recommendations. Also, as I mentioned earlier with the storage buckets, this is only looking at IAM permissions, so other kinds of permissions are not being reviewed by the recommender for roles. Okay. So the policy insights, what's that doing? So it, just like the most of these tools, I think all of the recommender suite, it is looking at 90 days at most of data. It's refreshed periodically around daily. So, something you did an hour ago is probably not feeding into the recommendations that you're seeing right now. In fact, the odds are something you did yesterday probably isn't, because it probably takes like a day to build that model. So, but it is frequent on a daily basis, and it is recent that update that's coming in. So you're getting new recommendations all the time. The activity that it's looking at over the last 90 days is any direct calls to the API where, your user or the service account called the API directly, or indirect usage such as you called an API, which then called an API, or you did something in the console which caused multiple APIs to be called. All of those behaviors are going to be tracked in the activity and will feed into the policy insights that then will feed into the recommendations. So currently the IAM policy insights are only looking at buckets, storage buckets, BigQuery data sets, and then Cloud Resource Manager, projects, folders, and organizations. So there are plenty of other places in Google Cloud where you can apply IAM permissions. For example, you could apply IAM permissions on a VM or on a particular table. And so just be mindful that currently those resources are not being tracked by the IAM recommender. So, if you want to track those, you're going to need to make sure you manage permissions at the project level, and then the recommender will be providing you with all of those great recommendations. So the other thing to note is that it is not looking at rules with conditional bindings. I think the presumption, this is what I'm presuming, but I think what they're thinking is if you've gone so far as to create a very specific role for a certain identity to be able to access a certain thing, and you've added conditional bindings to it, then probably you know what you're doing, is what I'm thinking. But if you just have a generic role like owner on a thing like a project, that's when those recommendations are going to kick in, and it's going to suggest something more restrictive. I alluded to this earlier, but there is the concern that maybe you didn't do this thing in the last 90 days, and then the recommender is going to say that you don't need that permission because you didn't do it recently and it's not in the logs. Well, this does use some level of intelligence where it tries to understand like how these tools are used, both by you and by other folks, and also like specific knowledge about your domain. So if it's very common for certain permissions to be used together, and or if you have like a custom role that you wrote in your domain that pairs those permissions with each other, then that's also being considered. So that means in some cases, even if you didn't do a certain behavior that would trigger a certain permission, the recommender is still not going to recommend removing that permission because it knows that it's likely to be used with the other things that you're doing. So the lateral movement insights. So this is focused on the concept of a service account in a certain project being able to act as a service account in another project. And this is so useful when you're building apps because sometimes, you don't want your service account to have to store like a service account key for some other service account in order to do something that would be pretty insecure. So the fact that you can allow one service account to act as another is great, but it can also make the permissions very opaque. If all I see is that this service account has permission to act as the other one, then I need to know all the permissions that other account has in order to know like how risky this is. And if you think about going down the chain of one account acting as another, then that makes it even more complicated. So this will monitor all of the service accounts that have any of these service account permissions on a service account from another project. So if the project that I own, Project A, has granted permissions to a service account in Project B, and then that service account has act as permissions in another project, that's where things get really sticky. And so these lateral movement insights are recognizing all of those situations where that exists. And so while some of the recommendations will ask you to change which role you've granted to a certain thing. Others will call out the fact that you have expose this lateral movement capability between two projects that you may not have intended. So, in practice, when you bring this all together, the recommendation system is going to, through the various ways, through the console and the API and the other ways you can interact with it, it's going to raise these recommendations that are hopefully useful to you and hopefully in the context where you need to see them. And then it needs to give you some actionable way to deal with it. So this is an example of what it would look like if I had received a IAM recommendation for something at the project level. And in this case, it looks like there is a user, Kevin Fan, and that user has the role Kubernetes engine admin. And it seems like the recommender thinks that that is a little bit too broad for what this user needs. It's suggesting a different role called Kubernetes engine cluster admin. And then in this interface here, we can actually see what the permissions were that the user had previously in the role that they used to have, and then what the change diff would be if we accepted this recommendation here. And then literally you can just click apply there if you have the correct permissions, and then you can accept this recommendation and say, I like what the recommender has offered to me and I want to do that thing and I want it to be as easy as possible. So you click apply and it does it and it logs that it did it. And so it has logs of both that the fact that there was this recommendation and that you approved it. So there's like a chain of history of how exactly that happened. So this is really useful in each of the different recommenders. When they recommend something, they're going to provide a similar interface to you to be able to see how it was and what the impact of making this change would be. Okay, now I think Sharon is going to start telling us some of the things that are new with the recommender.
Yes.
And for example, the hub, and I think pretty much we're going to switch over to your console now.
Yes. Yeah, so
Perfect.
this is a new UI that we just launched. And so I'll show everyone how you can get to this page. It should be available for you already if you own any projects or have permissions to see a project, as well as the recommendations under that project. So I'm just on the homepage of Google Cloud right now. You can get to it by clicking on like this recommendations link here, or you can navigate it by going to the side panel, going to Cloud Overview, and then clicking on recommendations from here. Yeah, so like I said, this is a new UI that we hope that is more useful to you. If you had previously gone to this page before, you know that it looked different previously. But this is the main dashboard. So we have some more information about how to use the hub if you are interested in it. And here I have an overview of what recommendations I have for this project. This is just a test project, so I don't have all of the recommendations that Lucas just talked about, but I have a couple that we can go over. So it shows me an overview of, all of my recommendations. I have 184, 182 of them are under security, and then I have 2 cost ones. And then if you have a lot of cost recommendations, we also kind of highlight your top ways to save money with the recommendation, as well as the savings that you have for each recommendation here. I only have one, but you can imagine if you had a large project, you could have a lot of different rows under here. One thing I'd like to point out is that in this top section over here, you can scope to an organization. So if you're curious about that, you can scope to that here. I'm just scoped to a project at the moment. So let's dive into like what the recommendation actually looks like. So I'm just going to go ahead and filter to cost on the left-hand side here. This is a live demo, so hopefully it loads. Okay, there we go. So here I'll see that I have a table of all of my cost recommendations. These are the machine type recommendations that Lucas had talked about, along with some details and columns here. So from here, you can go ahead and filter or sort by savings if that's what you want to do. So I'm going to go ahead and click into the details of one of these recommendations. I'll go ahead and share this as it loads. So this is telling me that I have had an instance that has had low CPU utilization during the last 7 days. I can look at the graph here and then see that it's recommending me to change the machine type from an E2 medium to an E2 small. And so this is just an example of one of the recommendations that you can look at. Again, all of the recommendations that you will have, you can play around with, and it'll have a similar look and feel to these as well. So yeah, again, this view is available to you today, and we're really excited for you to kind of play around with it and check it out on your own. Okay, we can go back to the slides now as we continue talking about, what's new. So one of our big focuses in the past year was around improving our reliability recommendations. So we have a couple I just wanted to briefly overview if you were curious and if any of these could help you with your cloud management. So the first one is quota. We have a lot of issues that come up with quota. And so this is kind of a more proactive approach that Google is taking to help notify you of potential quota issues that may impact your workloads before they actually become an issue. So we generate recommendations for your quotas if they've reached 80% threshold in the past 30 days. And the left panel is kind of that details panel of what it'll look like in the UI. You can also see these via API or BigQuery export, which we'll go over a little later. But you can see more details about, what quota is it, what service is it adjustable, and then what was like the peak usage during the past 30 days. And then from there, you can decide how you want to take action on them. On the right-hand side is about deprecations and breaking changes. We know how, painful that is for customers to deal with, but sometimes they do happen, for example, for security reasons or something like that. So we wanted to bring more visibility and an easier way for you to get notified of when deprecations are going to happen. And so we have implemented some of the GCE deprecations as recommendations today. So that's also available to you through API, through that UI that I just talked about, where you can get some proactive notice about what deprecation is happening or breaking change is happening, when is it happening, and then what actions that do you need to take action on them. So those are kind of two reliability recommendations. We have two others. So these are change risks. So we're really thinking about how can we proactively get ahead of anything risky and prevent misconfigurations before they happen. So the change risk recommendations are warnings before making a change to important cloud changes. So in that kind of right figure that I have, you'll see on the left-hand side, it's an example of what the dialogue looks like if you were to shut down a project that is what we deem unimportant, that we deem unimportant and is okay to delete. Whereas the panel on the right shows what happens if you try to delete a project that we think is important. We show a lot of different UI changes. We'll have a link to explain more about why we think that project is important. What kind of API calls has it been making? What kind of resources are on there? And so it's just trying to get ahead of that to prevent you from making any risky changes. On the other side of that, we also have recent change recommendations, which is kind of after the fact, notifying you of risky changes made to important cloud resources. So if someone in your organization or in your project has done something risky that we think should be reverted, we'll let you know, and you can see those recommendations through API or G-Cloud. And currently today, we support changes with projects, IAM policies, and service accounts, but we are looking to expand those resources as well. Yeah, so hopefully with all of those, they can kind of give you more of what we're expanding into and be more helpful as you try to optimize your cloud. So now we'll jump into kind of tips and tricks of how you should use Active Assist. And Lucas, yeah, feel free to jump in wherever. I just wanted to allude to kind of, we talked about like how you can see these recommendations today. So there's kind of three main categories of how you can see them. So one is in context UI. So you might have seen them if you're on the VM instances page. There's like a little light bulb where you can see recommendations. This is particularly helpful if you're a specialist who works in the console. We also have the recommendation hub, which I just demoed. You can also export all of your recommendations into one BigQuery dataset. And then you can also query all of our recommendations through API. So this is something that you might want to consider if you are managing recommendations for a project versus for an organization. If you're part of an organization that has a lot of different projects, or you're in charge of the all up kind of cloud management, you might want to consider doing something more of like a combination of hub UI or exporting to BigQuery so that you can set up a custom dashboard that's easy for you to and your team to look at. You don't have to go to the console every day. And then you can also consider API payload if you wanted to have more automation or flexibility. So that's just something to consider. We do have recommendations in all of these exposure channels, but it's up to you and what you're trying to do for maybe which one you want to leverage the most.
Yeah, I think it just depends so much on like what hat you're wearing. I know that like I work in projects a lot, like I'm building a service, and so I am interacting with the recommendations at the project level. But like I have managed a very large GCP org in the past where we had thousands of projects, and there were like when we were testing the recommender, we broke it because like we had too many recommendations for the system to handle in the early days. And so it was not feasible for me to really manage the recommendations in the console, especially before the hub was available. Like I'm not going to click through to 10,000 projects and look at those recommendations. So the only possible way for me to do it at that scale was really to mine the BigQuery data and to kind of have all the data going into there, to think of something that I'm now starting to care about, and then to see how many 10,000 instance recommendations there are. And then I could begin to use the data that came out of that BigQuery to like work with leadership and say, there's an opportunity to save a massive amount of money here, but we can't just click accept in the console at the org level. Like you have to work with those different teams who manage those applications to kind of have them do something. And depending on how you work with the cloud, like even if you are a project owner and you're seeing the recommendations in the project, it may be that the way your team manages a project is that you're writing Terraform configs and doing PRs and committing them. And so, maybe you need a programmatic way to get the recommendations so that you can feed them back into your software development process. And so having all these different ways of interacting with it is really great. And so I think you guys have an example here of like a workflow that you use or that some people use.
Yeah, this is kind of a little complicated, but this is something that you kind of touched on, Lucas, whether you want to use the UI versus API automation. So a common kind of pattern that we see is for large organizations, it might be more useful to programmatically view and manage your recommendations. Maybe like if you're new to Active Assist, it might be helpful to just go into the UI and play around with it. But once you have a good feel of it, you're trusting the recommendations and you say, hey, this is a good idea for our entire organization to start using. API automation is a great way for you to get integrated with existing workflows for your organization today. So for example, like if you wanted to automatically log Jira bugs or something every time you had a recommendation come in and assign that to the appropriate project owner or resource owner or something like that. That's a common pattern that we've seen with customers. And so you may want to consider that
Yeah, for sure. And just like going back to this side real quick, like the way I think about this is if you're literally living in the console and that's kind of how you interact with it and that's where you're going to see these things, then you have the whole UI and you have the hub. Um, if if you want to like build automation that is going to either handle or organize or pass these recommendations on somewhere else, then the most likely way you might do that is with the BigQuery data and having, the data is pushing into BigQuery and then you're kind of mining it from there. But then the API lets you like directly call the API and say like, show me these specific recommendations. And so you could ask for recommendations about a particular project that you're thinking of and do all that in a programmatic way. And so basically you have all these different ways that you can deal with this thing. And in my situation, I find myself using all of them in some form or another. Like I will learn about the like vastness of the concern by looking at the hub, and then I'll use BigQuery to sort of run reports and analyze like which parts of the organization should I attack first to get the biggest benefit. And then you can share some of the recommendations with people. I think we actually have a slide about that right now, because sometimes the person who is the one that sees the recommendation is not the same person who can take action on it. So Sharon, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, so exactly. This is just kind of on that same track. This is just a handy way for us in the UI to make that easy for you. So if you are working in the UI and you're not able to make the change, or you want to, quickly vet it with some coworkers or teammates and say, hey, is this okay to take action on? Like, what do you think? There are easy copy links functionality directly to the recommendation itself, or to like tables of recommendations that you can leverage to share that and kind of work collaboratively with your team.
Yeah, that's great because it's like I might be the one who happens to be in the situation where I'm seeing this. Like maybe I logged into the console today, but my teammate might be the one who actually has the right permissions to go like change the disk size or whatever it may be. And so the ability to just copy the link to this specific recommendation so another person can see exactly what you're seeing. Like I mentioned the IAM recommendation earlier, and you can imagine like if your current role is owner and the suggested role is some other role, like that diff is really long, and you might need to collaborate with a teammate to be like, can you verify that I'm not removing any permissions here that are going to break something? And so I think that is really useful pattern. The thing I keep coming back to is there's so many different people who are involved here, like in a large complicated environment like the one I used to work in. You have people who are responsible for the funding, and then you have people who are responsible for the technology, then you have the teams that are like actually building things. And whether you're talking about budget stuff or security stuff, there's potentially so many people involved, and they don't all have the same training and they don't all have the same background. And so this kind of allows you to have, depending on which role you're wearing, like if you're the billing person but you don't have IAM permissions to go delete a disk, then you might live in that hub and you might be like, hey team, I want to save this $10,000. What do we need to do to go actually realize that? And so I think the tool gives everyone the right kind of interface that they can participate with this process. So I think with that, we are done with our slides and we're ready to go take a couple questions. There was one question I wanted to queue up here, which is about whether or not it is possible to actually customize any of these things. Like, do any of these recommendations have any kind of parameters or configuration options where you can tweak their behavior?
Yeah, so it depends on a per recommender basis. So some of the recommendations look over like different periods of times or have different thresholds. So currently today, I know off of the top of my head that idle VM, unattended project, and IEM recommendations are configurable for their time periods that you're looking at. So you can configure them to look at longer or shorter time periods depending on your needs. So that's what I know off of the top of my head. But our documentation will know more about specific recommendations that you care about.
What I would say in response to that question is, because the underlying insights that are generating these recommendations are available to you, and like what I would say is, of course, they're configurable because you don't have to use Google's recommender. You could mine those same insights, the same raw data that the recommender is using, and you can make it do whatever you want it to. So hopefully, the person who asked that question can take a look at those insights and see maybe if they can come up with their own type of recommendations that are fed from the same data. Um, Let's see. We also had a question about whether you can reveal what sort of recommendations you might have in the works, if there are like particular product areas or features that you guys are aiming to address next. I know, like, I personally have been interacting with this recommender since it was in alpha like 5 years ago, and we had one recommender. It was the IAM recommender. And so since then, we've seen dozens of new ones, and I was wondering if you could allude to any of that.
Yeah, so we definitely do have a lot of investments to expand our product portfolio. I can't say to specific dates of when these things are coming, but we do have investments more into like the GKE and the SQL spaces for building new recommendations. We're also looking into improving some of the recommendations that we have. There have been a lot of asks, for example, what we just saw in that question of making more of the recommendations configurable, and improving kind of like the underlying algorithm and giving you more data to back up like why we are making recommendations specifically on like the compute ones. So those are all areas that we're looking into. But I would also encourage everyone, if you had requests, to reach out to the product team. We love to cater our backlog to what our customers are asking for. So yeah, feel free to reach out or reach out to your account teams with them.
Yeah, I have a few on a list that I've been collecting that I'll send your way. So we have another question here about the safety of these recommendations, and I think I have some feedback here, but I'd like to hear what your response is to, should we just go like accept all these recommendations willy-nilly and just trust 100% that they're always accurate?
Yeah, so I mean, all of these recommendations are Google backed. Like we believe in our recommendations. Otherwise, we would, not give you one. And I think there's a reason why we are giving you the option to apply them versus automatically kind of turning them on or applying them on your behalf. And so we always would love for you as a customer to make sure that this is what's best for you and your environment and your workloads. There are times where there are things happening that we don't have insight into because we don't have permissions into that data or something like that. There might be a reason why you have, an idle VM sitting around, like a very valid reason to having that, but we don't have insight into that. So we definitely do recommend for you to look at each recommendation carefully before deciding whether to apply them. But we hope that we at least give you a starting point for how to optimize your cloud. But yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on, like, in your experience, what has it been like?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on where you're at in your journey, I guess, and also what exactly you're trying to do. So, um, I think if you're like a more junior cloud person and you don't like know the best way to do everything off the top of your head, you don't have like many years of experience of knowing like exactly how you want everything to be, then when you start getting these recommendations from the cloud, I would encourage you to consider accepting them. I think, for example, if you had no idea what IAM permissions to set, so you just set owner, and then Google is like, here's a much better role to use, I think you probably should consider accepting that. But then there's another situation where like you know exactly what you're doing. You set those permissions that way for very intentional purpose, and like whatever Google is using as a recommendation for most people does not apply to your situation, and you know that. And so then you shouldn't accept the recommendation. You should do what's right for your team and for your application. And that's why you can decline those recommendations and say like, thank you very much, but I'm not going to do that. So I think, you know, the reason that I'm so excited about Active Assist in general is because it makes some of these decisions easier. Like not every person is an expert on every single thing. Like I might be really good at Cloud Run, but I don't really know BigQuery that well. And so if I get a recommendation about, you know, changing the service account on my Cloud Run instance, and I had 10 meetings about that service account and we landed on a certain thing for a certain reason, I might reject that. But if it tells me like I could save a ton of money by switching my slot setup, I'd be like, okay, because I don't know the right way to set up those slots. So I'm really grateful to have those recommendations. And so, you know, when we were talking about this in one of the UX discussions in the early development of the project, I was like, you know, this is like a self-driving car. It's like if your cloud had all this knowledge about the right thing to do, and instead of you having to make every decision yourself, like some of those decisions it could just do for you. And so Active Assist is like what they're calling that. But, you know, I was like, this is just you know, automation for automating your cloud work. And for someone who's brand new, I would say you're probably going to learn some things from these recommendations. You'll probably learn why it's better to do that than the other thing because of the recommendation. But if you're someone who believes you know better than the generic AI that's doing what most people might do, then please like do what you think is right and don't just blindly accept these recommendations. I think that's about all the questions we have right now. And we're just about at the end of time anyway. So do you have any final comments you want to share with our audience today?
Yeah, maybe as a final point, most of the recommendations that we showed you are available to you today at no charge. So I would love for you, encourage you to like take a look at the demo that I just kind of went over and try it out yourself on your own project. See what recommendations you have, look at the underlying data, choose to apply them or dismiss them as you would like. And as always, yeah, feel free to give the product team feedback or your account team feedback, or any feature requests that you would like to see in the future.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today for this discussion. It was really enjoyable. And as I mentioned, this is one of the products I've been using since before it really existed. And I really just think it is one of the things that makes Google a pleasure to use as a cloud. So I'm glad we got a chance to talk about it today. I want to remind folks that this session is being recorded. So if you're coming in at the last second and you missed some of it, you'll be able to watch the whole thing shortly at the same link where you're watching the live stream right now. And thank you, everybody. It has been wonderful. And I think we're done. Bye-bye.
At Google Cloud Next, we're announcing an amazing show.
All right, cue the music.
We're building the new way to cloud.
So that just means we get to think even bigger.
And now helping you connect like never before.
Let's start with development.
I'm loving this. Super cool.
AI is going to change the game for all of us.
Live on the demo stage.
I can't tell you how excited I am to continue blowing people's minds.
We're now in the midst of one of the most profound technology shifts in history. There's so much more for all of us to explore together that'll power this next chapter of digital transformation.